So let's begin with prayer, and I'm asking Brother Ryan to lead us in prayer tonight.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
For me, prayer is a surge of the heart. It is a simple look toward heaven. It is a cry of recognition and love, embracing both trial and joy. It is a simple glance directed to heaven. It is something great, supernatural, which expands my soul and unites me to Jesus. O heart of Jesus, wealth of tenderness, my joy thou art, in thee I safely hide. Thou, who my earliest youth didst charm and bless, till my last evening, O with me abide. All that I had, to thee I wholly gave. To thee each deep desire of mine is known. Whoso his life shall lose it, that life shall save. Let mine be ever lost in thine alone. I know it well, no righteousness of mine hath any value in thy searching eyes. Its very breath my heart must draw from thine, to make of worth my life's long sacrifice. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And on this special day when the Carmelites are celebrating all Carmelite saints, it's a great joy to be able to welcome Sister Mary here to speak today about Therese and the Sacred Heart. But let's invite Father Stephen Payne to come along and introduce Sister Mary to us.
Thank you, Brother Darrell. You may know that 2024 has been a major Jubilee year for St. Thérèse of Lisieux, marking the 100th anniversary of her beatification and the 150th anniversary of her birth. Even UNESCO joined in by officially recognizing her, quote, spiritual, cultural, and educational contribution to humanity. Closer to home, Therese's writings are available at a 30% discount until the end of the year. You can find information on that at the back. At the Center for Carmelite Studies, we've marked the occasion with a whole series of events on St. Therese. You can find links to the recordings of most of these events on our website. But we're especially honored to have Professor Mary Froelich with us this evening for the climax of all these Therese celebrations in our annual lecture in Carmelite Studies. Sister Mary Froelich, RSCJ, is a religious of the Sacred Heart and a professor emerita of spirituality at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She completed her MA and her PhD here in spirituality in the School of Theology and Religious Studies. So she's an alumna here. Welcome home, Mary. She's a noted scholar of Carmelite spirituality, as well as a scholar on broader issues in the tradition. She's an active participant in the development of spirituality studies as an academic discipline, and she served as president of the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality in 2007-2008. Her current research interests include contributions of the physical and human sciences to spiritual transformation, contemplative contributions to fostering ecological conversion, and methodological issues in spirituality. In addition to teaching, she writes and leads workshops on Carmelite spirituality, spirituality as an academic discipline, and eco-spirituality. She enjoys gardening, hiking, and leading outdoor retreats. Related to our topic this evening, Professor Froelich has published quite a number of important articles on St. Thérèse of Lisieux, and she's the editor of the volume St. Thérèse of Lisieux, Essential Writings in the Modern Spiritual Masters series from Orbis Press. So we're very blessed to have her with us this evening to speak on St. Thérèse and the Sacred Heart, history, story, and theology. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Steve. It is really, really good to be here. I graduated 33 years ago, and many things have changed here, but some things haven't. So, so it's good to be back, and good to be here with Carmelites. I have devoted a good deal of my academic work to Carmelite spirituality. So, and of course, being religious to the Sacred Heart, this brings together two of my great loves. Interestingly, the theme of Therese and the Sacred Heart has not been studied a lot, probably because Therese didn't actually use the words Sacred Heart that frequently. And she did write at one point, "I myself do not see the Sacred Heart as everyone else does." And so it has sometimes been thought that she didn't have much attraction to this devotion, or even set it aside. Now, even if that were true, studying her response to the Sacred Heart devotion would still be important, because it was such an important factor in the public life of France during the whole 19th century, actually longer than that, but certainly during the time of her life. And interestingly, in addition to that, I discovered in my research that the word heart is the second most used noun in her writings. There's a concordance of her writings, and it gives the number of uses of each word. First most used noun is Jesus. Second most used noun is heart, or cœur, of course, in French. So it obviously is an important theme, even though most of her references to heart are to the human heart, but many are, in fact, to the heart of Jesus, or the divine heart. So what I would say is that heart may be, far more than is often realized, a root metaphor and that it may be one of the keys to Therese's theological contribution. There's some of the list of some of the words that she used a great deal. You notice that the most used word is petit, little, but that of course is not a noun. So, and again, heart being the second most used noun. But so that I think heart is a root metaphor for her, and that comes from that notion of the root metaphor comes from the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. He says that a root metaphor is an image that functions as a central node where a rich and complex web of meanings intersects. It gathers and scatters. It gathers up associations and connections from, you could say, from below, from the subterranean networks of the body and the psyche and the imagination, and it scatters meanings along the pathways of conscious reflection. So the image that's up there, the bios is the subterranean dimension, the logos, the more conscious dimension. Now, an objection to the claim that heart is a key root metaphor for Therese is that what she said was that the Holy Face is the foundation of all her piety. And that certainly the face, the image of the face, was deeply significant for her in her personal psychology, and I've written an article about that, and others have written about why that is the case. But so that is not to take anything away from that the fact of the centrality of that. Nonetheless, I think that the metaphor of the heart, or the symbol of the heart, and the stories of the heart connect her in more significant ways to the public and communal stories of that are in the tradition and even in the public and political life of her time. So, despite the psychological centrality of the face as a central image for Therese, I believe that heart may nonetheless be an important key to her theological contribution. So, oh, there's this picture you see, and you probably can't see it that clearly, but anyway, she has both the face, the holy face, and then a child Jesus pointing to his heart. So this is where you can see they're both significant for her. So this is what we're going to do in this lecture. We're just finishing the introduction, and then we'll have three parts to the lecture. The first is traditions of the Sacred Heart. The second, Therese and the stories of the heart. And then the third, theology and Therese's own story of the heart. So part one, traditions of the Sacred Heart. The Sacred Heart devotion and the Sacred Heart symbol has a long history, and it goes back as far as the Bible. Certainly a central text, a New Testament text for this devotion. Most of the central texts are from John, and one of them is John 19:34, the pierced side of Jesus from which blood and water flow. Another one would be John 7:37 through 38, which says, "Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink. For whoever believes in me, rivers of living water shall flow from within them." And that within them, it says the word in Greek is belly, but it's often interpreted as heart. So by the 4th century Common Era, it was common to interpret the wounded side of Jesus allegorically as the birthplace of the church and the source from which all its sanctification flows. The sacraments, the Spirit, all flow from the wounded side of Jesus. In the Middle Ages, a series of mystics and visionaries, most of them women, spoke of experiencing a mystical exchange of hearts with Jesus and a mystical call to drink from the side of the crucified. By the 15th century, images of the pierced heart of Jesus were common in stained glass vestments, fonts, and furniture. But the wave of devotion to the Sacred Heart that has most influenced us today is that comes from the 17th century in France. And there were two streams that come from the 17th century in France, that both of which influenced Therese and continue to influence all of us today. The first is what might be called the personalist stream, which comes particularly from St. Francis de Sales and Joan de Chantal, as well as Jean Hughes. The spirituality of the Salesian spirituality can be summed up in Jesus' words in Matthew 11, "Come to me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart." For the Salesian tradition, the heart is the affective and spiritual core of the person, and Christian mission is all about winning hearts and building a communion of hearts. Therese would be profoundly affected by the Salesian tradition. She had an aunt who was a Salesian visitation sister, and both of Therese's older sisters, Pauline and Marie, each of whom were extremely influential in Therese's life, attended boarding school at that visitation, the same visitation where they had an aunt, while Therese was a little girl at home. And Therese's sister Léonie, after many difficulties, became a visitation sister in a different convent. Also, in 1895, which was a year when Therese's creativity was at its peak, the nuns of Lisieux Carmel received a copy of the Pensées of Sister Marie de Sales Chapuis, who was a visitandine nun who was a favorite of Pauline, who by this time was Mother Agnes and was, in fact, the prioress at that time of Lisieux Carmel. So Marie de Sales Chapuis taught that the merciful love flowing from the heart of God calls forth our trusting, childlike response of love and obedience. So this book of Chapuis seems to have directly influenced Therese's approach to the mercy of God, the preference for being like a child, and the way of love. Also in the personalist stream, there is the spirituality of Saint Jean Eudes. Jean Eudes first entered the community founded by Cardinal Pierre de Grégoire, who had focused on uniting oneself in adoration with the interior sentiments and states of Jesus, the God-man. Eudes later left that congregation and focused much more fully upon the devotion to the Sacred Heart. And his approach to and he founded another congregation, the Eudists, with that focus. The devotion to the Sacred Heart, as established by Eudes, focuses primarily on interior adoration of the person of the God-man, and that person is given totally in adoration to the Father. So the tendency of Eudes' devotion to the Sacred Heart was contemplative, theocentric, and mystical. And these were certainly among Therese's predilections as well. However, it's the other stream that is better of spirituality coming from the 17th century in France that is better known, and that is Saint Marguerite Marie Alacoque, who was a visitandine at Paray-le-Monial. And between 1673 and 1675, she experienced a series of visions of Jesus offering her his flaming cross-crowned heart. He enacted a mystical exchange of hearts with her, so that was in the tradition of these women mystics who exchanged hearts with Jesus. And he gave her some very specific instructions about what devotions he desired as reparation for the many offenses human beings were committing against God. And if these devotions then were done, he promised a great outpouring of love upon those who would give him appropriate honor. So the tendency of the Paray-le-Monial stream of tradition was to focus on God's pain and righteous anger at the blasphemous behavior of human beings, and to stress the necessity of specific and concrete acts of reparation. Another element of that tradition, near the end of her life, Marguerite Marie announced that Jesus had demanded that the French king should dedicate the nation to the Sacred Heart, and that failure to do so could lead to the monarchy's downfall. And this ended up greatly contributing to the politicization of the Sacred Heart devotion, particularly after the downfall of the monarchy. Another significant antecedent of Therese is Jean Perrault, also from 17th century France, who promoted the devotion to the child Jesus after she had had a vision of the divine child carrying the instruments of his passion. In the 19th century, the child Jesus was very frequently, or most frequently even, depicted with the heart open, and that is with the heart visible on his chest. And though you can't see it very well, this image is actually from the cloister corridor in Carmelite, Lisieux, at the time of that Therese was there. And so she would have seen this every day, or probably many times a day, as she, in fact, it said that this was the first thing she saw when she went into the cloister, when she entered Carmel, was the child Jesus displaying his heart. So then, moving on to the Sacred Heart in 19th century French public life. Actually, only 30 years after the death of Marguerite Marie, there was an outbreak of plague that killed half the population of Marseille. And the bishop of Marseille then believed that this was because of people's sins, and therefore he organized a series of public penitential rituals to make reparation and to dedicate the city to the Sacred Heart. And at the same time, the local visitation nuns began to promote the wearing of a Sacred Heart emblem pinned to one's clothes as a form of protection against the plague. The epidemic receded, and the city rejoiced, believing that it was the Sacred Heart that had saved them. Raymond Jonas, who is a contemporary author who wrote a book called France and the Cult of the Sacred Heart, observes that from then on, the story of Marseille became the reference point for an integral vision of a community saved by putting religion, and specifically the Sacred Heart, at the center of its identity and its public life. This experience of Marseille was quickly infused into the public mythology of the whole nation of France, was scaled up as a story of the French nation chosen by God, threatened by the sinfulness of its people, but saved by obedient and reparative acts to the Sacred Heart. Now, the revolution of 1789 did not actually begin as a confrontation with the church, but it very quickly escalated into a violent clash between two radically conflicting visions of good and evil. And it's not too surprising that the devout found it easy to cast this struggle in terms of Alacoque's story of the Sacred Heart. For them, the revolutionaries represented the evil forces of disobedience and dishonor to God, while the faithful were the legions who would willingly surrender their lives in reparation in order to one day see France again raised up as the pure and holy daughter of the church. Millions of emblems of the Sacred Heart, like the one on the image here, were distributed to be worn proudly by all those who were enlisted in the cause of God. In 1793, when the devout Catholics of the Vendée rose up in revolt against the secular republic, they went into battle wearing this emblem pinned to their chests. When they went down to defeat, their sacrifice was counted by their confreres as holy martyrdom and an heroic act of reparation for the sins of the nation. Meanwhile, the story of Jeanne d'Arc, framed in similar terms, began to receive increasing play in French church life. There is no actual historical connection between Jeanne d'Arc and the Sacred Heart, but in late 19th century France, or actually in the whole 19th century in France, they were woven together into a single cultural narrative in which Therese fully participated. Jeanne d'Arc was presented as the very archetype of France herself, called by God to the highest purity and heroism in the cause of her God and her King. As a child, Therese aspired to become a warrior saint like Jeanne. Then, in the peak years of her adulthood, Therese wrote and played the lead role in two plays about Jeanne. And this is, you see an image here of Therese dressed as Jeanne chained in prison. So we see how deeply she identified with this story of heroic martyrdom on behalf of the nation. So then, coming to the Sacred Heart very specifically in Therese's milieu, an event that took place in 1873. Now, 1873 is the year Therese was born, so she would not have explicitly remembered this, but nonetheless, it focuses the connections that we're talking about. The papal Zouaves were Frenchmen who had originally been recruited to defend the Pope, and after the Pope was defeated, they were later sent to defend France in the Franco-Prussian War. They brought with them a banner of the Sacred Heart that had been made by the Visitation nuns of Paray-le-Monial. On December 2nd, 1873, facing a massive and well-fortified German force outside Noigny, their leader, General de Sommy, handed the Zouaves the banner and sent them heroically charging across an open field. The charge was militarily indefensible. At least 198 out of the 300 Zouaves died, and no ground was gained. But their story almost immediately became a key legend of the Catholic narrative. The Zouaves were celebrated as martyrs, their blood poured out to regenerate the nation. Now, at the time that took place, Therese was only 11 months old. But as she grew up, it was a very fresh memory for the Catholics in her immediate milieu. In 1895, when she began to record her own memories that would become manuscript A of the story of the soul, The cover of her first notebook carried an image of heroic soldiers with banner unfurled, and she wrote across the banner, "Long live the God of the Franks." In manuscript D, Therese explicitly mentioned the Zouaves. She wrote, "I feel within my soul the courage of a crusader, of a people Zouave, and I would want to die on the field of battle in defense of the church." Perhaps even more significantly, Therese participated in the widespread admiration of General de Saulnies, the hero of Longwy. And it so happens that General Saulnies had written a prayer, and the prayer spoke of being nothing. And it used the image of a little grain of sand to express the general's desire to be hidden and despised. I don't quite understand how you be a general and be hidden and despised. But anyway, he wrote this prayer. And if you're familiar with Therese's letters, you would notice that that same image and that same theme appears quite frequently, especially during her early years in Carmel. And interestingly, some of the themes that of General de Saulnies' prayer are also echoed in Therese's Oblation to Merciful Love of 1895. So the loss of the Franco-Prussian War left France deeply dispirited. This gave impetus to a campaign inspired by Marguerite Marie Alacoque's call for a public consecration of France to the Sacred Heart. And also there became a call for the construction of a Church of the Vow, that is the vow to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. So by the time Therese was born, the Archbishop of Paris was committed to building a basilica to the Sacred Heart at Montmartre. And in years to come, literally millions of French Catholics would make monetary contributions and personal pilgrimages to the site of Montmartre. When 14-year-old Therese was about to set off on her pilgrimage to Rome with her sister and her father, she and the other pilgrims participated in a ritual of consecration to the Sacred Heart in the crypt of the yet unfinished basilica at Montmartre. Upon return from the pilgrimage, Therese sent a gold bracelet to Montmartre to be used in making a great monstrance. Raymond Jonas, the author of France and the Cult of the Sacred Heart, remarks that in 19th century France, the Sacred Heart was a soteriology, a salvation narrative with great moral and literary force. It was also just a symbol for Catholics who liked their religion on the syrupy side. Now that might be a little bit negative way of stating a basic tension within Sacred Heart spirituality as it had developed up to this point. On one side is the Sacred Heart as the image and reality of God's offer of deep, intimate relationship. And on the other is the Sacred Heart as the image of God deeply offended by sin, demanding reparation as the prerequisite of salvation. Yet, as Jonas noted, in the public realm, these two aspects were very poorly integrated. More often than not, the affective, relational spirituality of the heart in that time was syrupy and sentimental, while the heroic epic of the Sacred Heart's salvific action edged over into being more of a cultural and political ideology than an authentic Christian theology. In part two, we explore how Therese carried these tensions within her own being, eventually arriving at her own creative resolution. So part two will also have three parts. Actually, somehow or other, everything fell into three parts and trees in this talk. So how Therese understands the heart, her reactions to the tricentenary of Marguerite Mary Alacoque, and then what is called the year, her year of the Sacred Heart. So first, how Therese understands heart. Again, mentioning that she used the word a good deal. She used it 963 times in the writings that we've had. As in the tradition of Francis de Sales and Jean de Chantal, for Therese, the heart is the spiritual core and the affective center of the human person. It is the locale of the human capacity for intimacy, for fidelity in relationship, for the most powerful memories and the most profound convictions. Its knowledge is more profound than language. The heart experiences ranges of rich and subtle feelings, from deep suffering to joyous expansion and oceanic peace. Yet the heart can also be small and hardened. It can be the locale of bad faith as well as good. Now, that's one paragraph, but every phrase in that paragraph, you could find many, many quotations that would be examples of that. Above all, the heart is the place of relationship, and people can enter with their hearts into one another, and in some sense be within one another. People can be near in the heart even when they are distant in body. And the hearts of those who love one another can divine their loved one's most intimate needs. Those one loves have a special power to move one's heart. Therese writes of her heart being pierced by her father's critical words and later by his sufferings. Heart bonds that are formed by Jesus are stronger than blood. Two hearts can even beat as one. And the heart is also the special and profound place of relationship with God. God holds the hearts of all his creatures and wants every heart totally for himself. Our calling is to love God with all our heart. Only God sees to the bottom of the heart. Only God can fulfill the heart. God wants to rest in our heart and wants us to rest in his heart. Jesus hides himself in the depth of the heart. Prayer itself is an élan de cœur, a movement or surge of the heart. Therese wants to offer her whole heart, to give her whole heart totally to Jesus. So those paragraphs are only a pale sampling of the hundreds of references to the human heart in Therese's writings. But it suffices to demonstrate that the primary meaning of heart for Therese is that it represents the core of personhood, capable of the deepest affectivity and intimacy. It's not surprising that she easily applied this interior and relational way of understanding the heart to Jesus' human heart and to his relationship with her. At the same time, she was surrounded by the images and the language of the public devotion to the Sacred Heart, which generally tended to have much more of the pareidomonial emphasis on sin and reparation. It was only after she entered the Carmelite novitiate in 1888 that Therese began explicitly referring to the heart of Jesus. Her sister Celine, at that time, was going through a time of great suffering. So Therese wrote to Celine an ardent letter in hopes of bolstering her battered spirit. She wrote, quote, "Like Cecilia, let us sing a melodious canticle in our heart to our beloved. The canticle of suffering united to his sufferings is what delights his heart the most. Jesus is on fire with love for us. Look at his adorable face. Look at his wounds. Look at Jesus in his face. There will you see how he loves us." And this quotation illustrates one thing which I have noticed, is that very often she uses face and heart in the same reflections, the same thoughts. So the two are linked for her. A few weeks later, in a letter to her cousin, Marie Garin, Therese wrote that Jesus is burning with desire to enter your heart, and that what offends him and what wounds his heart is the lack of confidence, or perhaps we could say trust. Confiance in French is trust. Again, her phraseology betrays her awareness of the pareidomonial spirituality of reparative suffering for the wounds that sin engenders in the heart of Jesus. But we also note that even at this early stage, this is just when she's just entered Carmel, So she's 15 years old. We also note that even at this stage, Therese's reflection moves in a different direction than that typical of her era. For her, even suffering is a way to be tenderly intimate with Jesus. And the real offense to his heart is lack of total trust in him. For Therese, the divine heart is fundamentally a relational space of joyful, mutual indwelling. Now in 1890, so this is 2 years later, it was the bicentenary, I guess, of Margaret Mary Alacoque. And so there were all kinds of celebrations going on. And her sisters, Celine and Leonie, who at that time were not yet in a religious community, went on pilgrimage to Paray-le-Monial, with many other people, of course, to celebrate this second centenary of Blessed Marguerite Marie Alacoque. And while they were there, Therese wrote to Celine, "You know that I myself," this is quote, "you know that I myself do not see the Sacred Heart as everybody else. I think that the heart of my spouse is mine alone, just as mine is his alone. And I speak to him then in the solitude of this delightful heart-to-heart, while waiting to contemplate him one day face to face." So we see there that she's disagreeing in some way with the kind of spirituality of the Sacred Heart that comes out of Paray-le-Monial, and she's turning instead to the more nuptial mysticism kind of approach, that is the spousal relationship with Jesus. So the heart of my spouse is mine alone, just as mine is his alone, is her understanding of the Sacred Heart. Now, a letter that her sister Marie wrote the day before Therese wrote this letter indicates what Therese may have been specifically reacting to. The spiritual director of both of them, that is Père Pichon, apparently had written of the Sacred Heart as crowned with thorns with a big cross set up in the middle. It was, in fact, a very typical image of the time, the cross on top of the heart. And this was one of those emblems that had that kind of image. At this point in her life, Therese apparently found the overemphasis on suffering rather offensive. Her strong preference was to return to the nuptial mysticism of an intimate heart-to-heart with Jesus, her spouse. When her sisters, Celine and Leonie, returned from their pilgrimage to Paray-le-Monial, they gave Therese a copy of a meditation one of the priest's guides had offered there, and she transcribed this meditation into her scripture notebook. The priest, Père Tissot, had proclaimed, quote, "Were you to have committed the greatest possible offenses, as soon as you enter the wound of the divine side, hardly have you touched this sacred door, when love, like a devouring fire, comes forth, hastens, and in its ardor consumes even the smallest infidelities. It is an abyss that the greatest iniquities cannot fill up. Cast your sins into this abyss of love, and soon they will be pulverized, and nothing of them will remain." This text seems to have made a deep impression on Therese, because the images and themes stayed with her to the very end of her life. Perhaps most important was that it introduced Therese to meditation on the wounded side of Jesus as an opening into both tender intimacy and healing mercy. One of her last letters, written in June of 1897, so only a few months before her death, to Abbé Bellier, who was one of her spiritual brothers, meditated in terms very similar to those of Père Tissot on how the heart of Mary Magdalene had comprehended the abysses of love and compassion of the heart of Jesus, and how this, quote, heart of love, was not only disposed to pardon her, but even more offer her the benefits of his divine intimacy, raising her to the highest summits of contemplation. When one throws one's faults with total filial confidence into the devouring furnace of love, how can they not be consumed without remainder? And then, so the third part of this second part is 1895, which the centenary critical edition of Therese's writings calls her Great Year of the Sacred Heart. And we should also note that this is the year, 1895 is the year of the discovery of the Little Way, of the Oblation to Divine Mercy, of Manuscript B with its famous declaration that I will be loved in the heart of the church, and of some of her most striking plays and poetry. This was the year in which her spiritual and literary genius were at their peak. So it's before she becomes really ill, and so she's still kind of in her strength at this point. And she's weaving with verve and creativity the networks of image and story that would be her contribution to the life of the church. This is the year, and during this year, both her offering of the day, which is prayer 10, and her well-known act of oblation to merciful love refer to the beating of her own physical heart united with the infinite offering of Jesus. She also composed two poems, poem 23 and 24, that were explicitly related to the Sacred Heart. And one of them was entitled To the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And it began with a meditation on Mary Magdalene's search for Jesus in the garden. She wrote that when Jesus comes, quote, first he shows his blessed face, then a single word wells up from his heart. So it's noteworthy that her meditation on the Sacred Heart is centered not on Calvary or Gethsemane, but rather on a woman's passionate search for her lost beloved. And so it's more in the line of the Song of Songs, again, the spousal relationship. Moreover, what flows forth from Jesus' heart is not blood and water, but a word of intimate recognition and calling. A few stanzas further on, Therese adds, quote, even if I cannot see the radiance of your face and hear your sweet voice, I can, oh my God, live from your grace. I can rest on your Sacred Heart. The second poem, that was what I've been talking about is poem 23, but then poem 24, which is entitled Jesus, My Beloved, Remember, echoes similar imagery. She writes, quote, rest in my heart, it is yours. I fall asleep on your heart, it is mine. So typically for Therese, the heart is above all a place where two who love one another can rest together in total trust and mutual belonging. In these poems, as well as in her famous Act of Oblation to Merciful Love, imagery of the heart expresses one of her key theological insights. God has already given us what we are to offer to God, namely Jesus himself. In poem 24, she wrote, quote, I want to console you for the forgetfulness of sinners. Give me 1,000 hearts to love you. But that is still too little, Jesus, beauty supreme. Give me your divine heart to itself to love you. The oblation to merciful love says, quote, since you loved me so much as to give me your only Son as my Savior and my spouse, the infinite treasures of his merits are mine. I offer them to you with gladness, begging you to look upon me only in the face of Jesus and in his heart burning with love. So in these texts of the Great Year of the Sacred Heart, with their imagery of immense desires, consuming flames, waves of love, all connected implicitly or explicitly to the heart, we see Therese's poetic and theological vision emerging in the fullness of its beauty and power. At that point, however, Therese only had 2 years left to live, or less than 2 years. A few months after writing the second of these texts, the one that's there, she would enter the night of faith, which obscured the last 18 months of her life. In the midst of that, wait, there's the rest of the book. In the midst of that night of faith, she wrote manuscript B, which climaxes with her discovery that the church, quote, the church had a heart, and that this heart was burning with love. In the heart of the church, my mother, I shall be loved. Claude Rondois, who is a major scholar of Therese, writes, quote, she transfers that which in the devotion of her century is frequently attributed to the heart of Jesus, burning with love, to a heart of the church, which is her own invention. Even as she boldly claims her own identity with that heart, she affirms that, quote, in order that love be fully satisfied, it is necessary that it lower itself to nothingness and transform this nothingness into fire. In the months to come after that, as the ravages of tuberculosis took their toll, and as the spiritual night crumbled the imaginative foundations of faith, Therese indeed found herself lowered to nothingness, sitting at the table of sinners as one among equals. So part 3 of the talk is theology and Therese's story of a heart. Certainly one of the main contributions that Therese makes to the theological enterprise is to highlight the importance of what has recently been termed story theology, which affirms that stories themselves are a foundational genre of theology. This is an approach that justifies widening the scope of those whom we name theologians, since many people without access to or interest in a systematic academic education in theology have created images and stories that creatively express the gospel of Jesus. It is her story theology that is certainly one of the justifications for naming Therese as a doctor of the church. She did her most creative theological work as her own life processes interacted with and transformed the received stories, both sacred and secular, of her surrounding milieu. What I have aimed to show in this lecture is that stories about hearts, both human and divine, are a key to her story theology. It's clear from a close reading of Therese's writings that from early on she had a personal attraction to both aspects of the received story theology of the heart of God. So one aspect was the basic Salesian tradition of the heart as the affective core of personhood and the central locus of intimate relationships. And the other was the heroic story of her nation threatened by evil forces yet saved by the willingness of pure souls to deliver themselves over to martyrdom for the sake of repairing the scourges of the age. The church of her time had trouble integrating these two, so it's not surprising that Therese did as well. On the level of her prayer, she was much more immediately attracted to the relational aspects of the language of the heart. Yet throughout her life, her fantasies were captured by the stories of heroic martyrs performing reparative acts on behalf of their people. Despite this attraction to these heroic stories, Therese clearly reacted against a milieu of spirituality that placed too much emphasis on God's demand for staged acts of penitence for the sake of reparation. through a gradual process of both natural maturation and grace, she eventually discovered the root of integration between the relational and the reparative thrusts of the Sacred Heart spirituality that permeated her milieu. And I believe this could be one of her important contributions. To see this more clearly, it will be helpful to review 4 stages in Therese's story of a heart. And I just would also say that I didn't have this in the written paper, but as I was reflecting on it afterwards, I was thinking her openness to continually change and grow is one of her main contributions. That she was very young when she died, and yet she had gone through several major conversions, I guess you could say. So not just one, but several. And that openness is absolutely essential to theology, since theology must be the fruit of the most profound conversion. So I'm going to review 4 stages or 4 conversions, I guess you could say, in her gradual integration of the relational and reparative elements of Sacred Heart spirituality. First, at the age of 13, Therese had what is known as her Christmas conversion, which was a special experience of grace. And in that occasion, if you read her works closely, you see that it linked her to some elements of the nuptial mysticism that was associated with the pierced heart of Jesus. Her own heart was pierced by the flowing wounds of Jesus, and she had a deep interior experience of Jesus' thirst for souls. She writes, when she writes about her Christmas conversion, she says that all this occurred right afterward. And she was invited to participate then in this thirst for souls. And it wasn't long after that she participated in the group consecration to the Sacred Heart. So Therese was, just at the age of 13 and 14, she was already being initiated into the story of the Sacred Heart in both its mystical and its public aspects. But it wasn't yet a significant explicit focus for her. She was not yet herself claiming that language of the Sacred Heart. When she entered Carmel at the age of 15, she was more directly confronted by the pervasive use of language about the Sacred Heart. As she began to use this language herself, she bent it more toward its relational and contemplative meaning, and away from the more reparative emphasis, particularly the suffering emphasis that was common in her milieu. A personal crisis over the way this language was used by others came to a head in October of 1890, as we've seen, at the time of the second centenary of the death of Marguerite Alacoque. And that was when she stated explicitly that her way of understanding the Sacred Heart is that it is characterized by spousal tenderness rather than by being offended by sin and demanding penitential reparation. But nonetheless, she meditated deeply on the words of Père Tissot, who described the wound in Jesus' side as a holy door from which love flames out to consume all our faults. That text, focusing her attention on the biblically based image of the pierced side of Jesus, may well have been the catalyst that initiated a reflective process that would culminate in her movement into the 3rd and 4th stages. So 1895 can be called Therese's maturity, and I put it in quotes because it's hard to call somebody who's 22 years old mature, and yet for her that was her maturity since her life was coming to its conclusion. And that's the year then when her unique theological vision, creatively integrating the relational and the reparative aspects of the devotion, begins to see the light of day. At the core of that vision is the imagery of Therese and her divine spouse resting in one another's hearts. Their two hearts beating together as one at the origin of infinite waves of love. The theological insight that Therese embodied at this point in her process was the lived awareness that the most intimate union with God is also the most profound reparative act. It is her heart beating as one with his that satisfies Jesus' thirst for souls. In finding a personal resolution to the basic tension of Sacred Heart spirituality, she offers a rich vein for future developments in theological soteriology. But there's still more. Stage 4 is basically it's the night of faith, which was the last year and a half of her life. And her retreat of September 1896, so 1 year before her death, brought a breakthrough to another discovery. The heart where she rested intimately with her spouse broke open into the heart of the church. In the same moment, she realized that love must lower itself to nothingness and transform this nothingness into fire. Deep in the night of the loss of all consolation, she learned that the heart must break open even further, for she must sit at the table with sinners as an equal. The breakthrough of stage 4, then, is a yet more radical embodiment of her discovery of the oneness of relationship and reparation. She lets go of the satisfaction of experiencing herself as God's special victim who can give herself on behalf of others. And in doing so, if she's a special victim, she can remain apart from them. Instead, she recognizes her radical solidarity of heart with the most miserable of sinners. So, conclusion, what she finally learned is that union with the heart of God is union with the heart of all, without exception. Only thus will God's wounded creation be repaired and God's thirst for love be allayed. The drama of the Sacred Heart is finally not a story of evil sinners and heroic victim saints. It's rather a story of love as humble as the earth itself, letting go of all special claims in order simply to be with the people of the earth. In the context of Therese's time, this culminating insight, if applied in the public forum, would have entailed a major revision of the us, them, good, evil drama in which both Catholics and secularists were so invested. And of course, the same can be said of our time, that we are terribly caught in all kinds of us, them, good, evil dramas. So her insight that this must be revised is even more crucial theological insight for our global and ecological age, which is so tragically caught up in innumerable dramas of us versus them. So, Therese's story of a heart invites us to enter into an equally courageous journey toward radical solidarity in the heart of God with all, friend and enemy alike. This is her challenge to us, to discover how this can change the story of our own hearts and the story of our world. Thank you.